Hello everybody, how are you going? Welcome to Why Living in Australia is Impossible, a video by the same people that made the Why Nobody Wants to Live in Canada video, which it just explained a whole bundle of different situations that some people might be experiencing, others may not, but it gave a certain perspective. And so I want to know, why is living in Australia impossible? Because for some people it might be very, very difficult at the moment. Some people are facing some serious hardships and others will go, I guess I'm living an alright life.
2023, for only the third time in 40 years, Australia entered a per capita recession. The result? Australian wages declined to levels not seen since June 2011. Even with devastating bushfires, the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown, when polled, there was one thing that affected Australians more than anything else: the cost of living. Over the last few decades, Australia has experienced one of the greatest housing booms the world has ever seen. Since 1973, Australian house prices have increased by 36 times across the capital cities, and Sydney is now the second most unaffordable place to live in the world.
Ooh, man, and that's the crux of so many people's problem or difficulty or whatever you want to be calling it, especially in Sydney, of course in Melbourne as well, and sprinkled around the rest of the capital cities as well, which is a little bit a matter of perspective as well, considering if someone moves from Sydney to Perth, they go, housing prices cheap as. Whereas no one, I guess, really ever goes the other way around. It's a little bit difficult just with income and everything like that, unless they're doing FIFO stuff. But when you see this, and it's the second most expensive per capita or ranked by affordability in the world, followed very closely by Vancouver and then Honolulu, which I remember hearing about, which was just crazy, but beating things like LA and San Fran, that's nuts. And then, of course, also hearing that it's gone up 42 times. Like, for income to go up 42 times, well, it was 30 years, 50 years, in 50 years for income to go up 40 times. That's crazy. No one would ever get that. And like, you would get promotions, but no one's ever having an average salary going up 40 times in 50 years. And of course, this first graph did show that it has been a bit of a slump, which just compounds the entire effects of everyone just feeling the pressure. But it's also, over those 50 years, it's not like you've just been having these major problems throughout the country in terms of economically or anything like that. There's been worldwide things that come along, but as a country, it's fairly solid. And this is still a major problem. It turns into just a sport of the ages.
How and why did we end up here? This is the dark side of Australia. Australia is one of the most beautiful places in the entire world. Surrounded by oceans, filled with world-class beaches, cities, and parks, the country looks like a paradise. But if you want to live here, it's easier said than done. To buy the median home in Melbourne, a family needs to earn at least $170,000 per year. In Sydney, that number balloons to $260,000 per year.
It's just nuts. Like, how is Melbourne and Sydney so far apart? And I know a few people that have moved to Melbourne just to be taking advantage of that major difference. And I feel like I would love to know if it's average, medium, or what are you actually basing this entire statistics on, considering I feel like Sydney just has a massive clump of probably really high-end houses that Melbourne doesn't have as much. I mean, just living on the harbour compared to, I don't know what the housing prices are like in Melbourne living on the river, but I don't believe it's anything in like the 50, 60, 70 million range. Maybe, I mean, of course you could build a place if you had enough land, but I feel like there's probably a few places, a few areas in particular that are majorly skewing that higher, just because I can't see how you need 100,000 more in Melbourne versus Sydney. If it was 210, 220, but 260, that's a lot.
Compare this to the median household income in both cities of $100,000, and it becomes clear that home ownership is far out of reach for most Australians. Now, some might argue that this is only a Sydney or Melbourne issue, but that's just not the case. Since 2020, house prices in Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth have increased by over 50%, while wages only grew 12%. Home ownership is becoming less and less attainable for many Australians, especially young Australians.
Oh, it's rough. Yeah, we can't find anything really.
Young people have not had the luxury to benefit from skyrocketing home values and are constantly playing catch up. The result? Home ownership rates for people under 34 have declined nearly 25%.
Since when? That's a major factor of since when. I mean, of course, it's still 25%, so it's kind of irrelevant if we're making a comparison, but still 25% lower or 25% total does be reflected in these majorly just aggressively priced houses, but also just impossible markets for people to try and break into. Like they said, 12%, I think he said since 2020, if I remember correctly. That's crazy. 12% in 3 years in terms of like historically, if you're looking at interest or cash rates being at 0.1% or 0.01%, whatever, it just could crazily be low to have 12% at the similar time. But then, of course, it's nowhere near going to be 50%. Like, no one's ever going to be getting a 50% over 3 years, just increasing their wages, not through a promotion. And so, of course, you were just feeling like you're like, oh, I've gone from making $2,000 a month to 2.5 grand a month, which would be way more than 12%. It would be 25%, and you're still half what you need, going up 50%. And that's the thing with these areas, is the wages aren't the same in Brisbane as they are in Sydney and in Melbourne. And so houses are cheaper, but people's wages are cheaper as well. Like the Northern Territory, let's say in Darwin, like you can get some steals if you look at it in comparison to Sydney, but the wages are just lower. You might be looking at 60% wages. So of course the houses can only be so affordable, and that's just not with the population density.
The craziest example of Australia's housing crisis was this home in Sydney. It was sold without a toilet, without power, and without a kitchen. But that didn't stop a bidding war and someone paying $3.5 million. But what if you just want to rent? Surely you can find a decent place to rent. Sadly, no. Median rents in Sydney exceed $3,000 per month, while Brisbane is not too far behind at $2,500. Historically, Australian rental rates increased at a reasonable amount per year. However, since 2020, annual rental rates have skyrocketed by over 8% per year. People are caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to pay 2024 rental prices with 2011 wages. And this would all be fine and dandy if people could find a place to live. But the demand for rental units is insatiable. Every rental unit application is met with dozens, if not hundreds, of competing applications. Viewings have lines wrapped around blocks, and at the end of the day, renters aren't fighting for anything beyond a place to live, a place to sleep, and a place to call home.
And of course, there are always going to be some places that where people want to go. They want to live in these hubbub areas or where they've grown up or anything like that. And that's the catch-22 of Australia, where everyone lives in 5 places and most people live in only 2 places. When you see the sprawl of Sydney and Melbourne, because they are relatively coastal locked, it just goes west and north and just goes on and on and on and on, compared to being, let's say like London, a circular, where you have the river, but you're inland, so you're not really bound as much. And so you just have these absolute hotspots where everyone wants to go and everyone would love to live. And that makes it very, very expensive, of course, and that's in particular areas, but then it just flow-on effects all the way out, like all the way out to the Blue Mountains and beyond, honestly, in Sydney's case. I do just need to come back and have a look at this house though, because it is pretty darn insane what they are saying from an outside perspective, but for 3.5 million, they don't seem to say where it is. And of course, that is going to make all the difference. I mean, it's crazy when you go, oh, there's no kitchen, toilet, or power, but then you'd be going, well, I guess it's just in the market to be developed. And so it's basically being sold at 3.5 million land value. And then considering the property received apparently 30,000 inquiries in a month, including international clients, it clearly has to be, especially considering it's got a hill, maybe it's in a coastal Sydney region in terms of like in Bondi, let's say, or any of those kind of Tamarama, those kind of areas. I wouldn't be surprised for that price if it is a knockdown, if it would go for that. Elsewhere though, if you were out in Parramatta and you're paying for 3.5, that would be crazy. That's more unrealistic, but it could be a reality. If someone just, or if for some reason people want that place, there's just a major market for it to just go exponential.
100 other people applied for my apartment and did the interviews.
It was really difficult. We were on Facebook groups for a while. There's just so much competition.
The dream of working hard to afford a comfortable life is slowly fading, and hardworking, honest Australians are left feeling hopeless. All of this begs the question, why is real estate out of control? The first culprit that many point to is immigration.
Well, this week, the government say the migration system is broken and needs a massive overhaul.
From 2022 to 23, Australia welcomed nearly 740,000 people. To put things into perspective, that's more immigrants than any year in modern Australian history, and 200,000 more than pre-COVID levels. The impact of this huge spike in immigration is simple. More demand with the same housing supply equals higher prices. Specifically, economists and analysts believe that immigration has primarily impacted rental housing. The bulk of immigrants to Australia are temporary visa holders, and 70% of them are renters.
I just wanted to pause it here and actually just look at some of these statistics, because honestly, I'm blown away by the fact that it's only 70%. If you're on a temporary visa, a temporary migrant, the fact that it's not like 98%, that means 30% are buying property, which is pretty crazy. I mean, I wonder if that's international students being bankrolled by parents, perhaps. That can be common in Australia, which I guess, of course, also fuels the fire, so to say. However, I do find that using this graph as an explanation to what is going on a bit of an interesting comment to make, considering, okay, sure, if your comment is that 200,000 more immigrants were present in 2023 compared to 2020, and that's a fact, then sure, that's a fact. But if you're actually looking at the compounding effects over time, having this massive slump in 2021 down to 100,000, you lost like 400,000. That's 2 years combined of 2021 and 2022 that were just completely gone. So really, having 200,000 more is more or less offset by the previous years. So as much as, okay, you're having this massive influx, it could be a lot worse. It could still be 200,000 and not have the massive dip. Then what would it be like?
The impact hits hard in migrant-heavy suburbs. For example, Melbourne's southeast or Sydney's inner southwest saw 18% jumps in rents in the last year. In addition, immigrants are often willing to split their unit with more people to stretch their dollar, outcompeting locals. This has led to an increased yield on rental rates on real estate that had not been seen in Australia for decades. But what about housing? The argument that immigrants are a primary contributor to the increase in housing prices is quite weak. Australia's migration rate has actually decreased over the last decade and is in line with historical averages. However, over the preceding years and decades, there is one big difference. While immigration has continued to grow with the population, housing starts have declined.
The construction industry is facing a catch-22 with the cost of building a new home rising again.
Calling it a catch-22 might be a little bit of an understatement, considering that we need to build more houses to house everyone that is currently here, but we don't have enough people to build the houses that we need to build to house everyone that's already here, so we need to import skilled labor into the country and train them, which means housing them while they train, then while they build the houses, which requires more houses. So that's just such a minefield where you're going, well, we need more people, but we want less people. We want everyone here to transition just into building places. And that's the only way you could really combat that, let alone the fact that, like I said, everyone just wants to be living in one place. And so if you go out to Dubbo, then sure, you go build a house out there, go build apartments out there, but no one's going to live in them. And so you're going to be building these very expensive buildings because building materials are only more expensive out there because we're not like the US where we have cities and places everywhere. You can't just get things anywhere. You would be shipping them in from, well, maybe internationally or from Sydney or Melbourne, all the way out there to build these places for exorbitant prices that then no one can afford. So no one's going to ever build out there because no one can afford to build out there because they're not going to get the return, whether that be rental or selling. And so everyone then just gets compacted into these one areas where everyone needs to live because of resources and everyone wants to live because of resources.
In 2023, 170,000 dwellings were completed, the lowest amount in a decade. At the same time, Australia saw the biggest spikes in immigration in a generation. So what gives? Since 1966, the number of homes being built relative to the population of Australia has been declining. Specifically, in the year 2000, building rates fell off a cliff, creating a significant supply shortage whose impact can still be felt today. One of the main culprits for Australia's decline in housing starts is culture. Australia is a very suburban environment where communities and citizens have opted for urban sprawl over densification. For example, Sydney and Melbourne have about 2,000 people per square kilometer. Compare this to 6,000 in London, 4,400 in Munich, and 3,600 in Amsterdam.
Oh, okay then. That really helps me just gain so much perspective. I mean, I never knew London was that packed, but what per housing density Sydney? Like, what is Sydney? Is Sydney Greater Sydney or is Sydney CBD? Is it the city? I would love to know that. Where is the boundaries? Because it very quickly tapers off into rural, but in the middle of the city, do people actually live in the middle of London, Munich, and Amsterdam? Because a lot of the CBD has its name. It's the Central Business District, and that has changed over the last few years, like maybe extended few years, but realistically, not many people, population-wise and at large scale, live in the city. Is that different around the world? I don't know, because you have all these massive high-rises, but no one's living in them. Unless they live their life in the job, which a lot of people have to be able to afford their other house that they're never at. But otherwise, people are traveling longer and longer distances to be able to get into the city, which is congesting roads and all forms of transport. And so if people can live where they work, they'd love to, but there's no real houses in the city. I mean, of course there's no houses, but there's no real dwellings because we just build business skyscrapers, not as much housing skyscrapers. And if you do build a housing skyscraper, then you're running the risk of being like some towers that you get built and then your entire house kind of crumbles around you because of building standards slipping so much.
When compared to other major Western cities, Australian cities are some of the least densely populated in the world. Many Australians believe that a suburban environment is ideal for raising families and safe communities. Thankfully, Australia has a ton of land that is mostly unpopulated. Theoretically, they can continue to build outward and maintain sprawl. Sydney alone could add 280,000 homes in its greenfield growth areas. But sadly, this would work in theory, but Australia has a major NIMBY problem. Even though Australia is going through an extreme housing crisis, March 2024 saw the lowest number of detached home approvals since 2012. These aren't high-rise condos, these are detached, single-family suburban homes. Strong community advocacy and government red tape lead to extremely long approval times for housing developments. For example, to receive an approval for a single home development in New South Wales, it takes 111 days on average. In Liverpool, that jumps to 288 days. Compare this to Texas, where it generally takes less than a week.
What? Less than a week? Man, that is pretty crazy to have that comparison again. And it is interesting having the perspective going, okay, if you're saying that it's extended because of government red tape, is that because they're trying to do their due diligence and it's taking forever because of all the problems that the building codes and standards have become? I mean, like, you look at North America as a whole, and generally everyone would go, their houses are built better. They kind of either come with aircon or boilers, depending on which end of the spectrum you need to be living in, or both, I guess. And all of these houses, I mean, you might be able to pay through the nose for ducted and all those kind of things if you want to be adding those kind of extras on, but not many people have it. I mean, honestly, I was surprised that if I could find it, all of those houses had white roofs. Like, no one ever has white roofs. You're living in one of the hottest countries in the world, especially UV index wise, and everyone just goes for black ColourBond roofs. So this is pretty cool to be seeing that everyone has white roofs, because the electricity costs, and well, more so the heating or cooling costs in summer, just cook people. But nobody wants it. Nobody likes the black roof, or nobody likes the white roof, but it's cool that everyone here has done it. Then leading on to his point about saying how there's so much land, I mean, yes, there is a lot of land, but a lot of it isn't a very hospitable, especially not what people want in terms of it's just dry, arid land, and it very quickly becomes that. You have the Sydney Basin and the Melbourne Port and Bay and everything like that. But you go over those mountains and it just dries out. It just very quickly dries out. And so no one really wants to go over there. And we're already at so much of the limit. Like, you've got this big national park south of Sydney. You got a big national park north of Sydney. And otherwise, virtually all the areas are done. I mean, there's been a lot of new development along the road going from Sydney to Melbourne, and a little bit going north. But realistically, there's not much more sprawling space. And again, how far do people really want to sprawl? Because their job is still in the city. Tradies might live out there and then still have to get to Bondi in the morning, taking them 2 hours along the motorway. Like, people don't want to do that if they don't have to. So sprawling is only good if then you actually bring everything that people need with it, instead of just plonking a house in the middle of nowhere.
These long wait times have made it impossible for the government to achieve home building targets. Specifically, Australia is on track to build 40% less homes than needed to meet the government's affordable housing targets. The low rate of approvals for housing has created an artificial land scarcity, which in turn has driven up the price of land. Since 2020, home values have risen at 3 times the rate of apartments. With land becoming such a scarce resource, it further challenges developments, as it becomes increasingly expensive to acquire and develop land economically. But this is almost entirely by design, as scarce land benefits homeowners. This has had a tremendous impact on young people in particular. Remember, home ownership rates for young people have dropped by 25%, compared to only 8% for the general population. Okay.
Ooh, okay, that's a nice little statistic there, going from 25 to 8. And of course, everyone knows who are the demographics that have been bolstered the most by housing prices going up and everything like that. It's the older generation, or at least people that are definitely financially set up in high-paying jobs so that they can afford to be buying in earlier than other people that are just coming out of uni, just coming out of school, just starting families. Younger people, like they said, that's just the fact of the matter. There's not really much you can say about that, because people haven't had time to accumulate wealth, and the rest of the world is just running away from them because they can never keep up. But then again, to be saying that the entire thing is due to artificial scarcity, I don't know, I feel like it could be, but it's also impacted by cultural reasons as well. Like people, like I said, just wanting to live in a particular place. No one wants to live out west, let's say. And so if you do have no one developing out west because no one wants to live out west, so then there's nothing out west for people to want to live out west, so then there's no one building out west. It's just this big recycling bin where everything just goes round and round and round, and it just becomes more and more of a compact problem. And even then, though, to be hearing that people aren't that compact, that's the crazy part. That one blew my mind, because everyone does live in one area, but not that many people do. I guess with big cities with a decent population, but no one really thinking 3D, no one really thinking about going up. And again, that's probably just because people want their house. People don't say they want their apartment. People talk about house and home ownership.
We can all agree that immigration and low development rates are worsening Australia's housing crisis. But there is another critical factor at play: tax incentives. During the 1930s, Australia had a major housing shortage and wanted to encourage investment in rental properties. To encourage this, the country introduced negative gearing. Negative gearing allows an investor to offset the losses on a rental property against their personal income. For example, if you make $100,000 per year and lost $10,000 on your rental property, you can deduct the $10,000 off your personal income tax. This idea is pretty novel. In fact, out of the entire OECD, only New Zealand and Japan have these policies. During the 1980s, the government tried to change negative gearing rules, imposing restrictions on deductions that can be claimed, similar to the United Kingdom. But this was met with significant backlash, and negative gearing was returned to its original form. As the old adage goes, you can give, but you can never take. At the same time, in the 1980s, the government removed interest rate controls, which made it meaningfully cheaper for Australians to use debt to buy homes. This made negative gearing even more attractive, and allowed people to leverage debt to execute the strategy. Now, this alone isn't enough to put Australia over the edge. Not only can you leverage negative gearing, but you can also hold real estate investments in your retirement account, known as a super. For those who don't know, a super is similar to an IRA. Like an IRA, a super has meaningful tax benefits, and when buying real estate, rental income taxes are reduced to 15% instead of your marginal rate.
Yeah, which does make a nice compounding effect where people, once again, who have accumulated a lot of wealth or enough wealth, can buy these places and then not really have to pay much on them and just continually do this cycle. I mean, it was interesting to hear, and I guess it would be expected, that something like negative gearing is quite a particular incentive, which could swing either way in terms of if the whole world had it, okay, but if only Australia had it, I would also not be too surprised either. And so for Japan and New Zealand to be having it, that's an interesting combo. I understand New Zealand, they probably put it in around the same time, probably because of the same factors. They are just basically always paired with Australia in terms of their economic problems, and just generally we do run fairly parallel. But then for Japan to be doing it as well, I wonder why that is. I'm honestly surprised somewhere like China, with all their property development that has been going on over the last decade, let's say, that they don't have something like that. But I guess they have a bit of a different system in terms of it's just a lot of money just flowing in from big entities instead of a lot of money flowing in from little entities, being people. And also, for a bit more context, negative gearing doesn't affect your own personal dwelling. It is only for investment properties, and so that's where it does become this big cycle where once people have a grasp on that entire system, they just churn it out using negative gearing to be offsetting their income, so they're paying no tax, so then their borrowing power just increases as well, and you just wash that system, go round and round and round and round until you just, do whatever you want, basically. You just have such an entirely massive portfolio that basically can just continually just grow itself. However, the only thing has been negative gearing in a current climate like this is that rent rates are so high, and so the rental income is offsetting the negative gearing of the interest income, and so people aren't actually getting often that much negative gearing. I mean, it's still there, and people can still use it all they want. But that's the thing with the current climate is I don't think many people would probably have negative gearing. It's just an extra incentive that people use to leverage itself.
Unlike the US, where buying real estate through an IRA is a huge pain and costly, in Australia, it's extremely easy and often encouraged. But that isn't all. There's more. In 1999, the Australian government reduced capital gains on real estate sales by 50%. And if you're holding your property in a super, you're effectively only paying a 10% tax. There is almost no country on earth that has such a favorable tax regime for property investors. Australia is truly exceptional. This tax regime has been criticized heavily. The argument against it is that it materially benefits landowners and older Australians, and frankly, the argument is quite sound. These tax policies have encouraged speculation in real estate and are costing taxpayers nearly $8 billion per year. Some might argue that this is overblown, but when 50 to 80% of all investment properties are negatively geared, there is a problem. A system that encourages speculation on income-losing properties is highly flawed and very unique. But this has created another challenge. Australia has made it so good to invest in non-productive assets like real estate that no one bothers to invest in anything else.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. Like I said, it just becomes this massive sport where I've heard it in, I don't even know where I heard it, but let's say LA deals in clout, Miami deals in money, and Sydney probably deals in real estate. Like, that's the kind of status that people are on. No one cares what you do, let's say, as much as other places in the world, is what I've heard. It's just about where you live. And that just makes this huge, ever compelling cycle just for people to be constantly pushing more and more and more, which just makes the prices go up more and more and more, which of course makes sense. But man, is it an ever dangerous cycle, because we basically end up in situations like this where for years and years and years it just went crazy. Everyone was loving it that owned property. Everyone otherwise was able to kind of jump in because they could afford it. And then all of a sudden, over the last 20 years, 30 years, people went, I think the horse has bolted. I don't think I can catch up to it. I'm just on my own two legs. And no matter how fast I run, no matter what I can really do, my shoes will only travel me so fast. The horse has got four legs, and everyone that's already riding along on the train is loving life. And so, of course, I don't actually have the international perspective about how bad or how normal it may be in Sydney, but from everything they're saying and just the little bits that I hear, it certainly sounds like Australia is a different kind of animal when it comes to real estate. Like, every single thing is driven around real estate. Between mining, real estate, and I've said it before, cafes, that's the economy right there. Not many other countries are driven by real estate. Most other countries have exports, at least Australia has that, but real estate isn't even a blip on their radar, let alone being one of the top two.
Australia's productivity growth has been slowing over the last few decades.
Okay.
The average annual labor productivity growth between 2010 and 2020 was only 1.1%, significantly lower than previous decades. A lot of this is due to the lack of innovation and growth in non-service and non-mining sectors in Australia. The best way to put in perspective how little Australia innovates is to look at its R&D spend as a percentage of GDP. In 2022, Australia spent 1.7% of GDP on R&D. When compared to other major nations, that is terrible. The OECD average is 2.4%, and major countries like the US, Germany, and the United Kingdom are all far better than Australia.
Yeah, however, I am interested about Italy, Spain, and Canada, considering that Canada seems to be in a similar place to Australia, and so that could be a major economic reason why. I mean, it does feel like Australia doesn't build anything anymore. We send it, or we mine it, and then we send it straight to China, and then they send it straight back. That's basically the cycle that we have, because it's just, I guess, the cheapest, and that's how the entire business has been built. We don't even make our own steel anymore, like, not tiny little things, but otherwise, if you want to be a big I-beam, you got to get it from overseas, which when you're thinking about where Australia is, in the ocean sense, that's a long way. That costs a lot of money. And so that's why housing prices go up, because everything just gets shipped overseas, shipped back, and you're paying for that, which of course just realistically hurts everybody, because if the business that's making it, the company that makes it, has to pay more for it, you can bet that the retailer is going to have to pay more for it. And so everyone just kind of becomes numb to paying more for things. I mean, maybe not to the extent of New Zealand, and they're just crazy prices, just feeding off the rest of the world. But still, there are some things where people do become numb to go, oh, it's only that much. Okay then. And that's like a third of their yearly salary compared to other places where it might be 10%.
As a result, nominal GDP per capita and real GDP per capita have not increased over the last 10 years. Wages and job prospects are eroding while cost of living continues to rise. The loser? Hardworking Australians. Even when you compare business and income tax, it's clear that Australia is deciding that land ownership is the most important investment activity. Average income taxes charged in Australia are higher than all but 3 OECD countries, and corporate taxes are no different. Australia's corporate tax rate is 6.3% higher than the OECD average, and when comparing Australia's small business tax to even Canada's, Australia's is 2.5 times higher. Currently, Australia collects a disproportionate amount of government revenue from income taxes and corporate taxes, and a disproportionately low amount from real estate. As Charlie Munger famously said, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." Here you have it. a government that has incentivized speculation on housing while disincentivizing working hard and building productive businesses. The incentive to hoard land, the outcome, a terribly unfair economic system.
This is what I think is the best part, at least for me, about watching these videos, just because to be gaining that kind of perspective is invaluable. To be going, like I said, becoming numb to things, and then all of a sudden you get this perspective and you go, oh, 2.5 times, highest in the top 3, whatever it could be. You were just winning at all of these metrics that generally for most of the population you don't want to be winning at. You'll want to be losing them to have a nice functioning, easygoing lifestyle, let's say. And you can't manage that without owning a property and dumping all your money into that instead, because it's just so incentivized, like you said. And to be honest, something that he hasn't mentioned that I guess thinking about it now I'm surprised about is the fact that we might collect a disproportionate amount of income tax, but then you can bet your bottom dollar that we don't tax businesses on it. You don't tax the mining sector on it. No, you subsidize them. Yes, that's the Australian way. You don't want them to be running somewhere else. Where they would go, nobody knows. Where else is the world going to get their lithium and uranium from, and their iron and everything else? Where the crater in the ground that is just untapped in Australia is just ever flowing. But no one really goes, you wouldn't want to upset your mates. They might cut your bonus for the year. And so that's half the problem as well. You collect all this money and then you distribute it to the problem childs, to the people that really don't need it. They just don't. They might have all these places. They might be able to build 1 billion houses, but they won't. They just keep it to themselves.
I can already imagine the comments on this video, blaming political parties for the issues at hand. And that might be easy to blame any single government for the housing crisis in Australia, but in reality, this problem has persisted for decades. The Labour Party of Paul Keating saw a modest rise in housing prices, while concurrently seeing a rapid modernization and growth of the overall Australian economy. Overall, his tenure was mostly balanced. But then John Howard came in and saw the greatest rise in housing prices in modern Australian history. Under his tenure, housing more than doubled. Then, the Labour Party got 3 chances, but housing continued to grow, only slowing down because of the financial crisis. Following this was the coalition government. Tony Abbott, strike. Malcolm Turnbull, strike. Scott Morrison, strike. And housing still out of control. Now, with Anthony Albanese at the helm, we finished the decade with a massive increase in housing prices. If you bought a home in 1992 for $500,000, today it would be worth $2.4 million. And if you were born after 1992, you probably don't own a home and might never. The conclusion is simple. This is beyond political parties. Australia's housing crisis runs deep. It is something that cannot be solved by jumping from one bandwagon to the next. What will it require? Incentivizing business investment, lowering income taxes for hardworking Australians, abolishing negative gearing, lowering capital gains incentives, removing red tape to encourage developments, and educated Australians who can keep politicians honest. You are the solution, and your tool is policy. Good luck.
I appreciate his summary there, and it did feel like a fairly fair vocal output, but then I do want to be coming back to this graph, and it felt like it was a bit one-sided, so to say, like it was flat, and then up, and then flat, and then it was up, and then it's kind of flat. Make of that what you will, I guess, but it was interesting nonetheless, and certainly I agree with some things, and I disagree with other things, but that's fine. That's just all part of the course, and I think it was a fairly broad but correct brushstroke painting about how the entire economic football of real estate in Australia is just absolutely thrown around. It isn't a singular problem. It's a cultural ideal in terms of what people want and how they want to achieve it. And then it's just forever been compounding through legislation and all of those kind of factors that are coming into it to really just enable this very difficult situation for people to be able to dig themselves out of. And look, is the title correct? Is it impossible to live in Australia? No. Plenty of people thrive here, plenty of people love it here, plenty of people don't even ever own a home, and they just pack up their things and just go live on the road, just exploring this beautiful country. That's honestly one of the greatest things or counterpoints to this entire problem that you could ever have, just owning any kind of car, any kind of van, whatever you want to be doing, backpacking for goodness sake, just going around having and exploring some of the best beaches in the world. Honestly, what is there, like one beach per 15,000 years? There's so many beaches in Australia, but no, with the real estate, it's certainly a problem. Are there things that could be done to fix it? Yes. Are there immediately things that could be done to fix it? Maybe, but are there things that can be done now, leading into the long term, that change this for the future generations? You'd certainly hope so, and so hopefully the right paths can be taken, and so these cycles don't just continue, and people just dig themselves a deeper and deeper hole and push themselves further and further away from where their family is, from where their culture is, or anything like that. You still have to be allowing immigrants in, you still have to be having that massive and beautiful mixing pot of all these different people and cultures coming into Australia. So you can't just cut off one avenue and just stifle yourself with the other. No, you need to be trying to have a big, holistic view and still making it work. And that's very difficult, but it could be done, and it can be done. Someone just needs to be voting smart and thinking smart and implementing perfectly.